The wind cut through the wide-open plains of Dust Valley Ranch, carrying with it the smell of dry hay and rusted iron. Daniel Cole had worked those lands for 12 long years, 12 years of sweat, blisters, and loyalty. But none of that mattered now. His eyes burned as he stared at the crumpled paper in his hands, the termination notice. The reason? He had disobeyed direct orders. The truth? He had saved a dying horse. It had happened 3 days earlier. A wild mare, skin clinging to her ribs, hoofs cracked from the rough ground, had been dragged into the yard. The ranch owner, Wade Harlan, had ordered the men to let nature take its course. She wasn't branded, wasn't owned, and wasn't profitable. But Daniel couldn't just stand there. He stayed that night in the barn, feeding her water mixed with molasses, wrapping her legs in clean bandages, whispering softly, "You're safe now, girl." When Harlan found out, his face turned red with fury. "You don't break the rules on my land," he growled. "That horse costs me time, food, and money." Daniel stood tall, even as the other workers looked away. "Then take it out of my pay," he said quietly. But Harlan had no patience for compassion. He made an example out of Daniel, fired him on the spot, in front of everyone. The next morning, Daniel packed his old truck, glanced one last time at the stables, and saw the mare standing there, her eyes glimmering in the dawn light. He whispered, "Goodbye, Spirit," and drove away, the dust swallowing his past. He spent the next months alone, living in a rundown trailer at the edge of the valley. Every morning he'd wake before sunrise, look toward the hills, and wonder if she'd made it. Ranch life had been his everything, until compassion cost him everything. But life in Dust Valley had its own strange rhythm. At night, he'd hear faint neighs echoing through the canyon, distant, haunting, and almost familiar. He told himself it was just the wind. Until one evening, under a red sky, Daniel saw something moving along the ridge, a silhouette with a white mane shining against the sunset. His heart skipped. It was her. Spirit. And she wasn't alone. Daniel froze where he stood, one hand still gripping the wooden fence post. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving the sky streaked with orange and purple. And there, on the ridge above the valley, stood the mare he had once saved, Spirit. Her coat was no longer dull and matted. Under the fading light, it shimmered like silver. She looked stronger, broader, her mane flowing wild and free. But what took Daniel's breath away wasn't her transformation, it was what surrounded her. Behind Spirit, shadows moved, dozens of them. Shapes emerging from the brush, each one powerful, graceful, and alive. Wild horses. An entire herd. Daniel's heart pounded as they began to descend the hill, hooves rumbling like distant thunder. The dust rose around them, and for a moment it looked as though the earth itself was alive. Spirit led them straight toward the ranch. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It had been 6 months since he'd last seen her, 6 months since he'd been fired, humiliated, and left with nothing. And now she was back, with an army. As the herd approached the fence line, Spirit neighed, loud, piercing, and commanding. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a call. Daniel slowly stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. "Spirit," he whispered. She stopped just a few feet away, her breath fogging in the cool night air. The other horses stood still behind her, silent, waiting. Daniel could feel the weight of their eyes on him. Then, Spirit did something that sent chills down his spine. She lowered her head, pawed the ground once, and looked straight toward the main barn, the same barn where Harlan now stored the ranch's prized stallions. It was as if she remembered everything. And then, chaos. Lights burst on from the ranch house. Voices shouted in the distance. The workers had noticed. "What in hell's going on out there?" someone yelled. The dogs barked wildly, chains rattling. But the herd didn't flinch. They stayed firm, united, their formation tight behind Spirit. Daniel knew what was about to happen. Harlan would grab his rifle. He always did. Daniel raised his hands, whispering, "Easy, girl. Don't do anything crazy." Spirit's ears flicked back. Her eyes glowed like burning amber. Then, from the barn, a sharp crack, the sound of a door slamming open. Wade Harlan stepped out, gun in hand, his voice cutting through the air. "I knew you'd come back, Cole," he snarled. "And you brought trouble with you." The moon rose higher, casting long shadows across the yard, a man, a horse, and an entire herd standing against everything that had once destroyed them. And for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't feel small. He felt ready. The metallic click of Harlan's rifle echoed through the open night air. Daniel didn't move, not out of fear, but because Spirit stood directly between them, her body tense, head high, nostrils flaring. The other horses behind her shifted restlessly, hooves scraping the ground like distant thunder. "Step away, Cole," Harlan barked, his voice trembling slightly. "You and your wild pets don't belong here." Daniel's eyes never left Spirit. "They came here on their own, Wade." "You think I planned this?" "You always had a thing for lost causes," Harlan hissed, raising the barrel. "That mare was nothing but bones when I saw her. Should have been put down." Daniel took a slow step forward. "And yet she's the one standing here tonight, alive. Stronger than ever." The old rancher's jaw tightened. He aimed higher. "Don't test me." But Spirit didn't back down. She stamped her hoof, snorting loudly, a warning. The herd responded instantly, a wave of energy passing through them like a single living force. Their eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The workers began to gather near the barn, whispering nervously. They had seen fights before, over land, over money, but never over something like this. Never over a horse leading what looked like a wild uprising. Daniel spoke again, voice firm and low. "You fired me for caring, Wade. For showing mercy. And now she's back to remind you what mercy looks like. Don't you preach to me." Harlan shouted. "You think these beasts care about you? They'll turn on you the second they're hungry." But before Daniel could reply, Spirit moved. With a fierce neigh that split the silence, she reared up on her hind legs. The herd followed, 50, maybe 60 horses, rearing, kicking, neighing all at once. The ground shook beneath them. Dust rose like smoke. The dogs ran. The workers backed away. Harlan stumbled, his gun clattering to the dirt. For a moment, it felt like nature itself had come alive, centuries of instinct, loyalty, and defiance all contained in one powerful moment. Daniel slowly approached, putting a hand on Spirit's neck. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "It's okay. We're not here to fight." Spirit's breathing slowed. The herd quieted behind her. Harlan, still on his knees, looked up with wide eyes. You trained them?" Daniel shook his head. "No. I just treated one of them like she mattered." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that changes everything. Then, in the distance, thunder rolled, real thunder this time. And rain began to fall for the first time in months, washing the dust off the land, off the barn, off Daniel's worn jacket. It felt like something was being cleansed. Something old, cruel, and broken. The first drops of rain hit the dry earth like sparks on gunpowder. Then came the wind, fierce, sweeping, and wild, carrying the scent of freedom. The horses stirred, their coats glistening under the storm clouds. Spirit lifted her head toward the sky and released a long, powerful cry. Daniel looked around. The entire valley was trembling, not from fear, but from something greater, something ancient. It felt as if the land itself had been waiting for this night. Harlan stumbled backward, his boots sinking into the mud. "Get those animals out of here," he yelled, waving frantically at his workers. But none of them moved. They were frozen, eyes locked on the herd that stood unafraid before the storm. Daniel turned toward him. "You've ruled this place with greed and cruelty for years," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the wind like a blade. "You forgot what it means to respect the land, and the life that lives on it." The thunder roared, echoing his words. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating Spirit and her army of wild horses, each one standing tall, manes whipping like fire in the storm. The workers began to whisper. One of them, an older man who'd been silent for years, took off his hat and said quietly, "Maybe it's time we let the land breathe again." Another dropped his rope. Then another. The control Harlan had over them shattered like glass. He screamed above the storm, "You're all fools. These beasts will destroy everything." But as he shouted, one of the fences, the same fence that had once kept the horses caged, split in two with a loud crack. The rain had soaked the wood, and the wind tore it apart. The herd surged forward, breaking through, galloping across the open fields that had once been forbidden to them. Spirit stopped halfway, looking back. Her eyes met Daniel's one last time before she led the others into the dark valley, free and wild once more. Daniel stood there in the pouring rain, chest heaving, heart pounding. He had nothing, no job, no home, no money, but somehow, he felt richer than he ever had. Harlan fell to his knees, the mud splashing against his clothes. His voice was barely a whisper. "Everything I built, gone." Daniel looked at him, water streaming down his face. "You built fences, Wade. She built trust. That's the difference." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the rain answered. Then, far in the distance, Daniel saw the impossible, silhouettes moving along the horizon, not away, but back. The herd was circling around again. Spirit was returning, the ground was trembling beneath Daniel's boots as the herd circled the ranch once more. The rain hadn't stopped, it came down in sheets, turning the earth into rivers of mud. Spirit stood at the front, mane whipping like white fire, her breath steaming through the cold night. Harlan's voice broke through the storm. "You think this is justice, Cole?" he screamed, his hat long gone, his face streaked with rain and fury. "You think these animals care about you? They'll destroy what's left of this land." Daniel turned slowly, the lightning flashing behind him like a crown. His eyes were calm, steady, the eyes of a man who had already lost everything once and found something greater in return. "They're not destroying anything, Wade," he said quietly. "They're taking back what we took from them. Don't you dare lecture me." Harlan shouted, grabbing a shovel from the mud like a weapon. "You ruined my ranch." But he didn't finish. Spirit neighed sharply, the sound cutting through the wind like a blade. The herd stopped. Even the storm seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Daniel raised a hand. "Enough, Wade. Look around you." Harlan did, the barns half collapsed, fences broken, the land he'd once called his empire now unrecognizable. But beyond the destruction, something else had returned, life. Fresh shoots of green grass, awakened by the rain. Wild birds circling overhead. The land breathing again for the first time in years. "This ranch was dying long before tonight," Daniel said. "You killed it with greed. With fear. I tried to save one horse, and it turns out, she saved them all." The old man dropped the shovel, his shoulders sagging. The anger drained from his eyes, replaced by something hollow, regret. He stumbled forward a few steps, mud splashing under his boots. "I just wanted to leave something behind," Harlan muttered. "Something with my name on it." Daniel shook his head. "You did. But it's not your name this land will remember. It's hers." He looked toward Spirit, who stood tall and still, rain glistening on her coat. For a moment, the old man and the mare locked eyes. And even Harlan, a man who had never bowed to anyone, lowered his gaze. Then a crack of thunder split the sky, followed by silence. The storm began to ease. The air smelled clean, pure. Spirit took a slow step forward, lowering her head in front of Daniel. He reached out and placed his hand on her neck. She turned her head toward the open fields, an unspoken message. It was time to move on. Harlan turned away, his voice barely audible. "Go, Cole. Take your ghosts and your horses and leave this place." Daniel nodded. "I will." But one day, you'll thank the ghosts for what they left behind. And with that, he climbed the hill toward the valley's edge, Spirit by his side, the herd following behind like a wave of thunder fading into dawn. The night slowly gave way to the first shades of morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the valley wrapped in a mist that shimmered like silver. Every blade of grass glistened with water, every tree seemed alive again. The world was quiet, except for the soft rhythm of hooves echoing through the open land. Daniel walked alongside Spirit, the herd following close behind. The storm had washed everything clean, the anger, the fear, even the old boundaries that had once divided them. Ahead lay an untouched stretch of wilderness, where the hills curved gently into a wide, endless plain. He stopped on a ridge, looking down at it. For the first time in years, there were no fences. No signs. No human footprints. Just pure, open earth. Spirit stepped forward, standing beside him. Her breath was calm, her eyes soft. Daniel smiled faintly. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what freedom looks like." He reached down and picked up a handful of soil, dark, rich, alive. The same soil Harlan had once called worthless. But now, under the light of dawn, it looked sacred. The herd began to spread out, grazing peacefully. Foals nudged their mothers. Stallions raised their heads proudly, watching the horizon. The land was no longer a battlefield, it had become home. Daniel felt something stir inside him, a peace he hadn't known since childhood. The guilt, the anger, the loss, all of it seemed to fade with the mist. Spirit turned her head, gently brushing against his shoulder, as if sensing his thoughts. He laughed quietly. "You always knew better than me, didn't you?" She flicked her tail, as if answering, "I just followed the truth you forgot." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of storm. From the top of the ridge, the valley glowed golden, and Daniel knew what he had to do. He began building again. Not barns or fences, but small shelters made of wood and stone, open structures for shade, for water. He planted grass where the soil was thin. He carved a name into one of the stones with his knife, Spirit's Valley. The name wasn't about ownership, it was about remembrance. About the night when the land, the rain, and one horse changed everything. As the wind swept across the plains, Spirit lifted her head, mane glowing in the sunlight. She reared up once, her call echoing across the valley, strong, wild, eternal. The herd answered, their voices carrying far beyond the hills. Daniel stood there, smiling through the tears, whispering, "You're home now." And as the morning light spread across the land, it was clear, Dust Valley Ranch was gone forever. In its place, something greater had been born. A legend. A sanctuary. A promise kept by a man and a horse who refused to give up. Years passed. Seasons came and went, each one leaving its mark on Spirit's Valley. The grass grew taller, the streams ran clearer, and the herds multiplied, roaming freely across the land that once knew only chains. Daniel had aged, his beard gray now, his hands lined with the stories of the earth. But his eyes still carried that same calm fire, the one that had once faced down a storm with nothing but a wounded mare beside him. Every morning he'd walk to the ridge, leaning on the same wooden staff he'd carved years ago. Spirit was always there, older now, slower, her mane streaked with silver, but still proud. When she saw him, she would lift her head, and for a moment the years between them disappeared. "Hey, girl," he'd whisper. "Still keeping them in line, huh?" She'd snort softly, like she understood every word. Sometimes, in the evenings, Daniel would sit near the fire outside his small cabin and watch the horizon. Foals would play in the distance, Spirit's grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren. They ran wild through the open fields, chasing shadows, kicking dust into golden light. He smiled every time he saw them. Because each one was proof that what had been broken once had finally healed. One night, as the stars burned bright over the valley, a soft wind swept through the grass. Spirit stood at the edge of the herd, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Daniel followed her eyes and saw something he couldn't explain, a faint shimmer, like light moving across the sky. It looked almost like a road made of silver mist stretching toward the mountains. He felt it deep inside, the end of something, but not in a sad way. Spirit turned her head toward him one last time, eyes full of peace. She walked up to him, leaned her head gently against his chest, and let out a slow, trembling breath. Daniel rested his hand on her neck. "You've done enough, girl," he said softly. "You can rest now." That night, under the moonlight, Spirit lay down by the water. The herd gathered silently around her. Daniel sat beside her until the first light of dawn touched the valley. When the sun rose, she was gone, free again, somewhere beyond the wind. Daniel buried her beneath the old oak tree near the ridge, marking the spot with a single stone that read simply, "She came back with an army." Years later, travelers passing through the region would speak of a strange, sacred place, a valley where wild horses roamed without fear, where the wind carried the sound of distant hooves even when none could be seen. They called it the Valley of the Spirit. And they said, if you listened closely on stormy nights, you could still hear her cry echoing across the hills. The sound of the horse who returned with an army, and the man who believed in her decades later, long after Daniel's cabin had turned to dust and the fences had become part of the earth again, a young boy wandered into the valley. He was no one special, just a traveler's son, chasing the sound of the wind. The world had changed. Machines roared across plains, and steel replaced the soil. But somehow, this valley had stayed untouched, protected by something unseen. The boy had heard stories, tales of a place where the land itself was alive, where wild horses still ruled the dawn. He didn't believe them. Not until he saw it. The valley opened before him like a dream, endless gold fields swaying in the breeze, a river shining like glass, and far in the distance, the thunder of hooves rolling like a heartbeat. He climbed the same ridge Daniel once had and stood there, wide-eyed. Hundreds of horses ran free below, chestnuts, paints, dapple-grays, and at the center, a white mare with streaks of silver in her mane. She turned her head as if she sensed him. Their eyes met across the distance, calm, wise, almost human. The boy's breath caught in his throat. "You're real," he whispered. The mare neighed once, loud and clear, echoing through the valley. The herd slowed, forming a wide circle around her. Then, to the boy's shock, she began walking toward him, slow, deliberate steps, the earth trembling beneath her hooves. When she stopped a few feet away, he saw something glinting around her neck, a small piece of metal tied with a worn leather cord. He reached out carefully, brushing away the dirt. It was an old tag. Faded, but still legible. Spirit. The boy froze. He'd heard the name in stories told by his grandfather, stories about a rancher who was fired for saving a horse, and how that horse came back leading an army. He swallowed hard, tears stinging his eyes. "You're her family, aren't you?" The mare blinked slowly, lowering her head, almost in answer. Then she turned, looking toward the horizon where the valley stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun. Without thinking, the boy whispered, "Don't worry. I'll take care of this place." And somehow, the wind carried his words, over the grass, over the river, over the stones that still marked an old grave beneath the oak tree. She came back with an army. As the boy stood there, the herd began to move again, running past him, around him, through him, like a storm made of freedom and light. He felt the ground shake beneath his feet, felt the breath of the wild on his skin. When he looked back, the mare was gone, vanished into the morning mist. But her echo remained, in the sound of the wind and the rhythm of the land. And somewhere far above, in the silence between clouds, Daniel's voice seemed to whisper, "Take care of her world, kid. It's yours now." The boy smiled, lifting his face to the wind as the sun broke over the valley. The legend of Spirit, and the man who believed in her, would never die. Because some stories don't end. They simply ride on, with the next heartbeat of the earth.